Hello and welcome to the holiday episode of What Would Jane Do? And today we're going to be examining that really fraught issue that many of us face this time of year, which is what to wear. Now we are all emerging from, or hopefully emerging from, the pandemic over the next month or so, particularly over in Europe, where I think you might have gone down to lockdown again, but some people are having parties. It's a bit touch and go. But anyway, we will still be facing that issue of what to wear at the office party, at the neighbour's drinks party. So we thought we would ask Jane Austen what she would do. But to join me to think about this, I've got a very special guest, Kate McFarlane. Now, Kate is, in her day job, is a civil servant, but by night, the exciting things she gets up to is she is part of a reenactment society called the 33rd Foot, but that's not its full title. So over to you, Kate, to tell us exactly what your society is called. It's very impressive.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, as you can imagine, we don't say this a lot, but it's His Majesty's 33rd Regiment of Foot, 1st Yorkshire West Riding. And that denotes the regiment because the army at the time had several different regiments and companies spread out all over England. And obviously numbering the units was a good way to keep track of them. And our particular society is very keen on presenting an ordinary, boring, if you like, regiment of line infantry at the time of Jane Austen. So one of the things we do is we take part in the grand parade at Bath, and our musicians in the regiment get a chance to lead a parade and play music of the time, and it just helps the parade go with a swing, and everybody enjoys seeing redcoats.
Indeed. So the West Riding is part of Yorkshire, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Well done. And in fact, all of the countryside around England at the time of the Jane Austen would have been known as the Ridings. And that brings me to one of my favourite fashion bits of kit. And you can't really see it on a podcast. I'm going to describe it to those of you listening at home. But it's a hooded red cloak. And this is based on, this is the hood of the cloak. This is based on a copy of one at, I think it was Snows Hill Manor, which has a lovely costume collection. And my husband made this for me, and it's beautiful, soft, luxuriant wool. They would often be lined, sometimes they'd be quilted. So countrywomen of the time would have been walking around in this. And I think there's a lovely drawing of the time. I think it's Mrs. Hurst and her friends going out in the countryside in their little red cloaks. And enough women of the time wore these, because as you can see, they're very cheerful, they're very warm, to be known as national costume. And in fact, you still see them in Welsh national costume today. And when people see me walking around in this, they go, ha ha, Red Riding Hood. And I say, yes, absolutely right. This is my Red Riding Hood. It's a countrywoman's cloak of the Ridings. And that's what it means. It wasn't a cloak that you'd wear riding a horse necessarily. It was your countrywoman's cloak. So that's where that comes from.
So that's actually really interesting because it's the same colour as the red coat uniform. So one wonders if there's a factory somewhere that's got a second line for women. You've got the men's uniform and you've got women's coats. It's a good business going there.
Well, there's several myths around fashion. And one of them is that the soldiers of the time wore red to not show blood. Well, that's not true. It's mainly because red dye was one of the cheaper dyes. So, of course, your uniform is going to be made out of the cheapest cloth and the cheapest dye.
Well, I think I will go with always the economic argument.
Exactly.
These things. So before we talk more about reenactment, which I would really like to look in detail when we're talking about the actual clothes themselves, let's think about how people in Jane Austen's day found out about fashion. Today, you can't get away from it. You open a newspaper, you look at a magazine, you watch television, on the internet. And I expect many of us, when there's a red carpet, we all have a look to see what people are wearing. So we are attuned to fashion, but it doesn't necessarily mean we follow it, which, there is enjoying fashion and then sort of following it, isn't there?
Absolutely.
But anyway, what did the Regency period do? So I came up with a few things. So Kate, chip in. The first one I went to was fashion plates.
Yes, very much
Now,
so.
fashion plates. I've got one here as an example. Got a very useful book called Jane Austen in Style. I don't know if you know this one, but
I absolutely know that one. Yes.
This is a typical fashion plate.
Yes. Beautiful.
So what you would have done in your circle is that you would have been looking at the fashion plate and then worked out how to make it work. You could have work out the pattern to do that. But it would have
Absolutely.
told you, it would have sent signals, things like these colors are in sleeves, long sleeves, short sleeves. That's a just Jane Austen-esque thing, isn't it?
Yes,
Gloves,
very.
all that, bonnets. So that's the sort of visual cues they would have used.
And it's
Do you have a
interesting that
favorite
you
fashion
mention
plate?
fashion plates, because a lot of the news would have been spread at the time, yes, through newspapers, but also fashion plates. And what I picked out recently was that there would have been hawkers coming around selling things as well. And interestingly, if you had somebody shouting your wares or in a shop, you wouldn't have had to pay a tax on that. Whereas if you advertised, you did have to pay a tax on that. But let me just tell you the magazines that were available at the time of
Yes.
1800 onwards. You had the Ladies' Magazine, you had the Gallery of Fashion, you had the Ladies' Monthly Museum, Le Beau Monde, La Belle Assemblée, Ackerman's Repository, and the British Ladies Magazine. So those are just a few of the fashion magazines out there. And they weren't just about fashion, they were often interesting things for ladies to entertain themselves with. So they had little puzzles, they had maybe a crochet pattern or a knitting pattern, little snippets of news, possibly court news. And people would pore over these, share them amongst their family and friends. Yes, so there were printing presses, there were fashions out there. And let's not forget that fashion never acts in a vacuum. So fashion reflects the times around you. And people often criticize Jane Austen. Oh, why doesn't she mention the World War that's going on in the background? You know, her brother was in the Navy. All this fighting was going on. And it was a very real fear in England at the time that Britain would be invaded. There was an actual possibility of that. And in fact, there's one of those historical incidents that people wouldn't believe if you put it in a film, where there was a French landing party in Wales. It's a historical document, and the Welsh women of the time, because all the men were out fishing, I think, saw them off with pitchforks and whatever they could find handy, and they were wearing tall Welsh hats and red cloaks. And because of that, when they saw them at a distance, they thought, oh, the army's been mobilized, let's run away. So they did, and that's how some of the women of Britain saw off the French. It was a very small landing party.
That's the costume drama I want to see.
Oh yes, and that is why I love history and I love reenacting, because you're constantly coming across amazing snippets of actual historically documented fact that people would never believe if you put it in a movie. The truth is always stranger and far funnier than fiction. I'm not even going to go into Napoleon being chased off by a herd of rabbits, but it did happen.
Yeah, I mean, I write historical fiction, obviously, and nowhere better for getting ideas than the real thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so okay, so we've covered fashion plates, and just to mention, of course, that there would have been a time delay.
Yes.
By the time people use this, so fashion probably, one of the things that you're aware of when reading Jane Austen is the sense that country fashion's maybe a little bit behind the capital.
I think they show that, don't they, in the Sense and Sensibility movie as well.
Yeah, so there's an economic reason for that, i.e. they haven't got the money, but there's also just the delay of the message filtering out to the provinces. So how did the message come out? Well, that's another thing, another way, which is through the sort of friends and relative network. Now, a really good place to sort of see this at work is the Elizabeth Shackleton Diaries, which I was reading about in another very good book, which is The Gentleman's Daughter by Amanda Vickery.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about here and hilarious is that she overtly uses her friends as like sources of information. And there's one particular friend called Bessie Ramsden, who's like a sort of personal fashion reporter for her. And they are a little bit bitchy about things, which is great because Jane Austen in her letters is able to be a little bit acerbic about people. These aren't, saints, they're real people. So it's very important to them all to be au courant, up to date. And they can also make fun of themselves and other people. So there's an incident where Betty is remarking on one poor young bride who was wearing fashionable trimmings of wax strawberries and they melt in the fire. This is a slightly earlier period. This is like Jane Austen's youth and her parents' generation, where they had all these massive headdresses with, you know, caged birds on and stuff, silly things like that. And then there's the debutante in a hoop who takes a wrong step and kicks up her heels, hoop and all exposed. This is a day before underwear. This is very embarrassing indeed. So you only have to look at a few Hogarth pictures to know what might have been exposed.
Absolutely.
So there you go. The sort of the network of friends and family was also very important as it's equivalent of the WhatsApp messaging or the Snapchat or
Jane Austen mentions frequently in her letters to Cassandra either sending Cassandra on a mission to find out the latest frills and furbelows, or she herself goes to London or goes to Bath to purchase the latest that's out there. And interestingly, I was reading that the Burlington Arcade was invented around now, and it had 72 shops in it in London. So that's your first shopping mall, if you like. And that would have been amazing for the ladies of London to go in and have all these shops dedicated to their shopping pleasure, and obviously lending libraries and things like that, where you might as well have had fashion plates and ideas about fashion. Coffee houses, tea houses, fashionable shops like Gunter's Ice Cream Parlour. These are all places where you would have seen and and look at what everybody else was wearing, and especially at assemblies and balls. And if anyone had been able to travel abroad or just come back from abroad, of course, travel around at the time was very, very dangerous because of all the wars going on. So travel was very restricted. But if you were lucky enough to have a brother in the Navy, or or someone who'd come back from an East India Company buying trip, then you might have got this beautiful cashmere shawl as a gift or a present. So Indian influences were very prevalent. Obviously, with people doing the Grand Tour before Europe was plunged into war, they were bringing back marble statues as their trophies and their tourist tat, if you like. And if you lived in a very big house, you're going to bring back a very big trophy. And hence lots of statues of Greeks and Romans and things like that, which heavily influenced, and even Egyptian. Napoleon had a campaign in Egypt. So things happening around the world, although you might be in a very tiny village, influences filtered down very much so through the population, through the styles in London, through the styles in Paris, which had been the fashion leader of the world at the time, and through events going on around you. And fashion reflects that. It's not in a vacuum. It's very often influenced by the doings of the day, which I find fascinating. Sometimes it's almost a rebellion against what's going on. So you've had the 1790s period of very full skirts, lots of brocade embroidery, lots of frills and furbelows. And then you look a few decades later after the French Revolution, and you've got women suddenly appearing a lot more simple. And you have cropped hair sometimes coming up. And I was interested to learn that was a fashion that arrived from people having their hair cropped before they went to the guillotine, and women wearing red ribbons around their neck as if they'd had their head cut off. And that's a very gruesome fashion, but it was almost laughing at death, I think. And people at the time were very, very practical as well. So you would have enjoyed, you would have made the most of what you could at the time, and you would have had your enjoyments, and you would have reused everything. And if you couldn't have more than a few dresses,
before we go on to the actual making of it, which is where we're going to, because I haven't yet mentioned that you're beautifully dressed this morning. But the statue comment you made, of course, what many of us think of the unclothed statue, but of course what we're really thinking of is not that, is the drapery of the togas and the Greek there's a special name for that gown. I can't remember.
I tend to think togas, but it is more than that.
But when you look at the 1810s clothes, in particular, you can see that influence. It's moving away from the very wide hooped silhouette of the 18th century, which people are familiar with from TV and films of like the French court of that era.
Yes.
So just to finally finish on the visuals, then of course we've also got the extreme version of this that you see in cartoons, which I don't think people were taking as fashion tips, but they mocked fashion, like the transparent gowns and all that kind of thing. But more seriously, portraits. If you were Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, people would look at what you're wearing and it would
Very
be
much so.
aspirational. It's your
Yeah.
Instagrammer. Okay, so right, Kate, you know about making the clothes. So you've already mentioned the wonderful cape, which I'm already coveting over here.
It's my favourite. It's so warm and lovely and cheerful.
So clearly there wasn't a department store that you can go in and get made to measure. You could get secondhand clothes,
Yeah.
of course, if you needed them. But you either made the dress yourself or you paid somebody, if you had enough money, to make it for you, the seamstress, the tailor. So how difficult is it to make a Regency outfit?
I'm laughing because I'm a terrible seamstress. Jane
Okay,
Austen would just not know me just on the basis of my stitching alone.
social cut there.
So you would have been, you had to be very good at sewing as a woman and as a man. Women followed the British Army, but not to necessarily do the sewing or the cooking. The men could all do that perfectly well. The women were actually allowed to follow the army as laundresses because the one thing the men didn't have the time to do was do their laundry. So women would actually be paid to do the laundry. And that's how they made some money, and that's how they were allowed to follow the drum. So not everybody was, but you had about, I don't know, about 10 women per 100 men or something like that. And they would each have their little groups of men and they did the laundry for them every day. Yes, so back to what I'm wearing. I am wearing what I would call, you can't see this at home if you're listening, a bag dress. And I call it a bag dress because it's a simple tube and it's got a tie at the top to sort of bring it around my shoulders and my chest. And it's got a tie in the middle at the waist. And apart from that, it's pretty much a tube. And then I've got little puff sleeves on my dress. So I can turn this dress into a nighttime dress, going to a ball and bling it up with some jewelry and stuff. But during the day, I can wear my sleeves, which are detachable. And these ones button on. I've got 3 buttons around the top of the puff sleeve. And it ties with a drawstring at the top and it ties with a drawstring in the middle. So it's a very, very simple dress. And this is made out of mustard coloured linen. You would have all natural fabrics at the time, no man-made fabrics in the sense of things added to them. So your average sort of middle class Jane Austen would have been looking at muslins, cottons, linens, calicos, and hopefully dyed some interesting colours. They had block printing at the time. So why I love the Regency period is it's just on the cusp of industrialisation, but not quite. So for me, it's the last great craftsman era where things are made as well as they can possibly be made. And look at the furniture of Chippendale and all the beautiful plasters and things of the ceilings, the painting, and all the arts at the time were exploding right across Europe because of all the revolutions and the changes going on in the outside world. And fashion was no exception to that. So, as you say, even if you were in a little bit backwater of Chawton, maybe, and you didn't necessarily know what was going on as it happened, and very few people in the country knew what was going on as it happened. You had your news often weeks later. Then basically you would live vicariously, yes, through the Harriet Smiths and the Lady Caroline Lambs of the time, who were the it girls, if you like, and news would filter down precisely about what people wore, and you would probably have your little moment of rebellion or wearing maybe something in the jewelry that you wore or the ribbons that you had in your hat. So you wouldn't necessarily have been up to date with fashion, but you would have been very interested and you wouldn't have wanted to feel that you were out of date. So it did filter down quite slowly, but it did filter down.
I like the buttons on the sleeves because that picks up the theme that things were made to last.
Yes.
Very different from, I mean, I think we're reaching a point where there's a trend in the celebrity circles to reuse gowns, like the Kate, the Duchess of Cambridge, is doing this, and others are following. That idea would have been very much, yeah, we already do this, because it seems so wasteful to throw out a huge piece of material just because it's gone under the arms or something. So you would remake it, turn it. That's one of the things. I had a lot of fun with this because, as some of you might know, I write a children's series imagining the young Jane Austen as a detective. And in the first book, the Abbey Mystery, there's a running gag about Jane Austen's gowns. She only has like 3 or 4, but she takes away with her. And when one of them gets trashed through a carriage accident, she has to put it in the rag bag, and it's presented in the book as a notice of mourning with black edges saying, you know, the gown is going to be duly interred in the rag bag, and that her third best gown is becoming her second best, and the second best is promoted, you know. So had great fun with that gag, but they didn't have huge numbers, so each outfit was noted and notable. And of course, the way you protect it is things like aprons, detached sleeves,
pea
all
shoes,
that kind of thing.
chemisettes. Yeah. So basically, I've got one. I'm wearing a very, I can't really show you, but I'm wearing a very thin cotton nightgown, I guess you'd call it, which is my chemise. And your chemise was your undershirt, or I would look at it rather as almost like a bra. In terms of underwear, you wouldn't walk around in public in your chemise. That would be very fast, very loose. You would have been lost to all sensibility to do that. So you would wear your chemise underneath, and it's usually out of a very plain material like a calico, a cotton, a linen, that you could easily wash. You're not going to see it on your outerwear. It will stand up to a bit of wear. And your finer materials, your nice printed materials, you would keep on top and probably wash very rarely, if at all. You might brush them off. You might dab at little bits of spots that got on them. But the rough and tumble of the shoving your clothing in the dolly and pounding it in a tub would be left for your undergarments, really. And they're very comfortable. So when you first get calico or some cottons, it's quite tough and rough, but after a few wearings, it's beautifully soft and very, very comfortable indeed. And as you said, I wouldn't wear underwear normally. Underwear became a thing more in Victorian times. So it was very, very common. It was actually quite racy to wear underwear because it wasn't the common thing.
I think the idea was maybe it meant you were exposing your legs, you know.
Exactly.
So it's the thing that if you didn't wear it, meant you didn't need to.
No, and even if I fall over in this dress, nobody's going to see anything. I'm wearing a long tube that comes down to my ankles. So, you know, unless I really do tip over like that lady wearing hoops and throw my legs in the air.
Hoops is different though, because hoops holds the material
hoops
away.
Holds them apart. And that's the thing. The whole point about the Regency is it's draping around your body. And there is that famous fashion myth almost of women dampening their skirts so that the draperies would become more transparent and cling to their bodies in a very sexy way. And I'm sure some women, very fast women, did that in society, but not your average woman going to your average assembly ball. That would have actually been seen as really, really stupid, because the last thing you want to do is catch a cold. You can be carried off with a cold. So why would you actually court danger that way?
Yeah. Okay, so this takes us into just a brief digression into the most outrageous Regency fashions. I think it's easy to find some of the really outrageous ones in the sort of 1780s, because there you've got, as I was saying, the huge headgear, the huge hoops. They also had this rather odd passion for thicker eyebrows. I know we've gone through this eyebrow weaving thing. I don't know if that's still happening after the pandemic, but
fashion
they did it by
for extremes, isn't it?
Yeah, they did mouse skins.
Yes.
So you'd affix mouse skins, like little bushy things.
And I cannot tell you how thrilled I was to go to Fairfax House in York and see some mouseskin eyebrows, because I'd heard about these. I'd never seen them before. I thought, what the heck do they look like? Have you got a little mouse with a tail hanging off your face? No. They'd got tiny, tiny little bits of fur, and they were shaped into Kim Kardashian type eyebrows. And you thought, okay, yeah, you might have been able to get away with that. And I also saw on the men's side of things, padded stockings, because if you were a bit of a wimpy man, you would pad out your calves. And the men's fashion, we haven't really talked about that, was very much so at the time to be fit, to be athletic, to be like a Greek statue, and almost to appear naked. If you think about the tight breeches they wore, often in pale colours, their waistcoats were often pale or quite gorgeous, and they had dark overcoats over that, but their linen was very white and very pale. And the idea was you were a naked statue as a man. And your groin area is actually emphasized by the high waists and the long tails of the coat. It's basically saying, hi girls, look at this.
Shall we
We don't
say
tend to think
it
of that
is?
these days, but that's pretty much what was going on.
Yes, it's kind of framed.
It is framed beautifully, yes.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we have to remember that this isn't the first time in history, because the Tudors did the whole codpiece
Oh,
thing.
absolutely. They were right out there with their cod pieces. Yeah.
But one area people may not realise was very scandalous was the open neck shirt for men.
Oh, yes.
Now, this is quite funny, so there's a portrait of Byron, and Byron, obviously, towards the end of Jane's life, is just the most scandalous, idolised, famous person in Europe. You know, everyone's got a view on him. And there's a portrait of him where he has his shirt undone and no cravat. And that is the equivalent of
lying on a bearskin rug.
Yeah,
With it all
it's
hanging
really louche and
very
sexy.
Yeah.
I've just got out of bed kind of look.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is, Byron himself was actually quite a smart dresser, so he probably didn't really. It was just a portrait thing. But anyway, if you wanted to be Byron-esque as a young man, that's how you would then appear. It was the sort of
yes, it's like careless,
rebellious.
I've just thrown this on kind of
Yes.
look. I don't really care what you think of me. But of course, if you're rich, that's great. That's a fine attitude. If you try and turn up to work like that, you probably get turned off.
And then the other change, of course, is the one we haven't talked about, is the hair. So at the beginning of Jane's life, people would have worn powder and wigs and hair, extra hair, like extensions. And by the end of her life, there was more of a move towards natural hair. Wigs were now associated with old men or footmen or, judges, particular positions and jobs. And I imagine some people did wear wigs if they were unhappy with their hair, but certainly it was nowhere near the extent of the wig manufacturing industry that was the 18th century.
No, that was, I think, the height ever of wig making. You basically had your head shaved, a lot of the men, underneath, so you could wear all your wigs, and you hardly had any of your own hair at all. And interestingly, in the Regency period, hair fashion, you're right, did go very natural. You could do a lot with your own hair. But if you're in the rush to go to a ball, you might wear some hair pieces, like I've got this. And
instantly curled.
It is a line of curls that you can tie like a bandeau around your head, and instant curls without you having to press them. And they would have had various preparations for setting curls and keeping them in curls and things like that. So you had little hair pieces that you could pop in, but a lot of it you could do with your own hair, and women did mostly have quite long hair. But it's interesting that you could get away with a very short crop, and indeed Caroline Lamb, very racy girl, had that. So I love the Regency period because although it's got its own fashion rules, within the time you could wear any style of hat at all. You could go absolutely crazy with your hats, and yes, a lot of different hairstyles you could get away with. Oh, and the men, by the way, you would never see a man with a beard. You would never see a man with a beard. The only people that you would see with a beard would probably be mad, or very, very old, and maybe shaky with the razor. Or in the British Army, the man with the beard was allowed to have a beard because they didn't really understand hygiene at that point, and the pioneer was like the person who slaughtered all the meat on the hoof, because of course you've got to keep your meat fresh. How do you keep it very fresh? Well, you have it live until you need to kill it. So he was allowed to have a beard because they thought it stopped germs going into his body. The beard just was act like a filter or a mask.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. So if you see a film about Jane Austen and there's lots of beards, that's wrong.
They haven't done their research.
The final sort of little place just to dip into is the fact that a great moment of fashion was when you got married. It's not that you wore a fashionable wedding dress. That wasn't a thing. It was that you would have a trousseau put together for your married wardrobe. But this would also include things like linens for the house. It's not just clothes.
Yes.
But that would be probably the time in your life as a woman where you would have the most spent on your clothing. That's your sort of launching from the father's house to the husband's.
Yes, and in fact, Jane Austen has that lovely scene where the sisters come to Bath, I think in Persuasion, with their mother to shop for their trousseaux. And there's much excitement about that, isn't there? Because it's the time where you really get to spend a lot of money And it's also thinking about the future. It's a sort of promise for the future, isn't it? That you're going to use all these
Yeah.
lovely things in your new home.
So let's talk about what would Jane do about this. We've dipped in onto her view a couple of times, but let's think about what she made of the actual concept of fashion and what it's saying. I think that for her, some of the highest words of praise for fashion are neat and elegant.
Very much so. Yes. And it's interesting, isn't it? It's that sense of propriety. It's that sense of elegance. And I have to say, in my other life, not a reenactor, you will often find me, or you mostly find me, in jeans and a t-shirt. I'm a jeans and a t-shirt girl. That's my fallback outfit. Even at work, I'll wear slightly nicer jeans and t-shirts, but it's pretty much, I like to sit on the ground. I like to lean against walls when I'm reading my books and things like that. I'm a scruff, basically. I'm proud of it. So I like to wear Regency clothing because it's the one time in my life when I can be elegant, feminine, and that word elegant is what I get a lot when I'm wearing these clothing. And it's nice. It's nice to step into somebody else's shoes and be elegant for a day when that's not my other persona. And for me, that's why part of the reason, there's so many reasons why I do reenactment, is because it gives you a chance to try on somebody else's shoes for the day. Oh, and talking of shoes, I've got some to show you to demonstrate the difference between classes. Here is the sort of boot. It's a little half boot that I would be wearing with my day dress going out in Bath. And it's got a very, very thin sole, as you can see. And I can tell you, having walked the hills of Bath in these shoes, your feet ache like crazy after a week of doing this. So if you think about Lizzie Bennet striding over the fields, she probably would have had a lot thicker sole than this. But it's a very elegant boot, isn't it? There's nothing wasted. It fits your foot very neatly. And if you look at a lot of the fashion plates, even the men have very neat, small feet. So you can see elegance was prized in the day. You've got very long silhouette, tiny feet, tiny hands, and quite strong athletic bodies. So it's interesting, isn't it, looking at period pictures and paintings and fashion plates as to what is seen as attractive. And I think at that time, definitely strength, naturalness. You don't have very heavy makeup, and that's definitely a reflection of moving away from the fashions of a few decades ago. Fashion often goes in cycles. So if you've had a very ornamented, heavily made up cycle before, it's going to move away and do the opposite and go on to something that's very natural. The poets at the time were all about praising nature, and Robert Southey and the late poets and things like that. And when I am in my camp follower role, well, it's not a camp follower, I'm a woman of the camp. I'm legally allowed to be there. So I'm not following the army, I'm with the army. But as a legally married woman of the camp, this is what I would wear. And it is a heavy, very tough leather boot, pretty much similar to what the men would wear, to be honest. And it's got a heel plate, like a horseshoe at the end, to toughen that boot. So a lot of countrywomen, and I'm thinking of Lizzie Bennet marching over the fields now, she might have had something this thick, but she would have had very tough leather soles to stand up to a lot of wear. And these are straight lasted as well. So I put neat's foot oil on my boots when I first get them, and that sinks into the leather. And if you wear these shoes on the same feet for a long time, they will conform to a left and a right. But generally, it's much cheaper to manufacture shoes in a straight last, as they call it, not with a left and a right. And much for poor people, you wouldn't have had a left and a right. You could swap them around for equal wear, and that made them last. And in Yorkshire particularly, we have clogs. So if I'm just standing spinning or weaving or knitting as an ordinary woman, I might wear clogs in the home because they're very insulating against the cold, and they're very cheap to make as well, and they're very comfortable.
I do think the modern fashion for Crocs is basically just clogs, isn't it?
Pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, in different materials. What you were just saying reminded me that, of course, we've forgotten to mention the name of the period, which is Beau Brummel.
Of course, Beau Brummel.
And the reason why, one of the reason why it went from gentlemen's fashions, which were like the macaroni, the
like peacocks, weren't they?
Yeah, and morphed towards something which is much more like the colours that men have worn for a couple of centuries. I think it's changing again now, actually.
A little bit, yeah.
But certainly the sober suit
Mm.
started with Beau Brummell and his ideas of the form, the fitting, how it was supposed to be.
Less is more.
Emphasizing the person wearing the clothes as opposed to the clothes
Yes,
themselves.
yes, exactly. And you know, he's famous for saying something along the lines of, "Oh, the clothes are wearing him. I make my tailor." In other words, I am the clothes are just to show me off. And it was quite revolutionary in terms of the Prince Regent, who was a great leader of fashion. He was definitely more is more. You know, you couldn't have enough tassels, gilding, feathers, embroidery to suit him, and he was famous for it. And in fact, that's why I think they eventually fell out, because Beau Brummell had tried to rein him in once too often. But Beau Brummell, yes, was a definite leader of fashion. Everybody knew about him. He was famous for a beautiful silhouette and for looking beautifully turned out. But he was also famous for basically saying, once I have turned myself out beautifully, I don't think about it anymore. I don't then wander around saying, oh, everybody's looking at me. Oh, I wonder if my cravat's straight. He took a lot of time to do the presentation, but once he was out there, that was it. He was done. Which is quite interesting, isn't it? It's not so much I want everyone to look at me, it's I want to set a style, and then once I'm done, I'm done.
So Beau Brummell was the stylist to the rich, and this sort of clues into a fact that, of course, as it is now with our designer and all the rest of it, fashion was a social signal. And the scene in Jane Austen's novels that I always think of this is the one at the assembly rooms right at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, where the Neverfield party comes in, and they are marked out by not only everyone whispering about their relative wealth, of course, but afterwards in the sort of discussion amongst the family of what happened. It's what people were wearing is of great interest, particularly to Mrs. Bennet, and she says how delighted she was with Mr. Bingley. He was so excessively handsome, and his sisters are charming women. I never in my life saw anything more elegant than their dresses. I dare say the lace upon Mrs. Hurst's gown, and she's about to go off in a great long spiel about lace and ribbons. And poor old Mr. Bingley says,
Mr. Bennet.
Sorry, Mr. Bennet, yeah. Here she was interrupted again. Mr. Bennet protested against any description of finery. So I reckon there's a bit of a home joke going on there, because if you look at Jane's letters, there's quite a lot of discussion of lace and ribbons and things. And why not? Because it's important. It's not you were saying something about where you fitted in society, about how you turned yourself out.
Yes, I'm wearing some little crocheted mittens, and they're beautifully made and they're very delicate, but they give me the appearance of wearing gloves, and I can still use my hands to sew with my fingertips and things. And you would have worn clothing for warmth. I'm sitting in quite a cold house now, so I've got my shawl around me, and I would have had my little lace fichu or my chemisette to protect my chest a bit more. But definitely you would wear clothes to show your status. And we are a very visual creature, aren't we, humans? So we pick up visual clues before we even talk to anybody. And especially in a society that was very hierarchical at the time, and status and wealth, but mainly your breeding was very, very important. You could pick up all these visual clues as to whether somebody was worth approaching, or maybe of a similar status or rank to you. And if you were a poor person, you would have coarser, less well made clothing possibly, but certainly tougher, heavier clothing that was easy to come by. And if you, I can't imagine Jane Austen, when I imagine her at all, wearing silks and satins. She was a housekeeper. She kept house for her little family in Chorlton. She would have been feeding chickens, chopping up things. She would have had aprons on, obviously, but she would have been your sort of what I think of as middle class fashion tier of muslins, calicos, wools, fabrics like that. Not to say that she probably never encountered a silk or a satin gown, and if she'd maybe been in London, or somebody made her a present of it, or she'd got a windfall, maybe she would have spent it on that. but it's not practical. It's not something, and don't even get me started on wearing a muslin gown near a rose garden. They just don't mix. Let's leave it at that. So if you're wearing a very fabulous gown, A, you probably need somebody to help you get in it. So that's a status thing. And B, you're never going to do anything menial because it will just ruin it in seconds.
So I think she's also interested, and it comes through in her novels, about the possibility of dissonance between what you're wearing and who you are.
Yes.
So she's very, very down on ostentation. And where I think you find it is particularly in Fanny Price, who she says is her favourite heroine. She's got a soft spot for Fanny. And one of the big sort of moments for her character is over a small thing, which is a cross. And the chain for that cross, and there are competing people giving her a chain. One's more showy and large, social pressure to wear it, but she actually wants to wear the more modest version given by her brother. And I think you get a sense of how Jane feels about fashion, is that you have to wear the thing that your soul is comfortable with. It's actually an expression of your inner being, what you wear externally. So she wouldn't be, I think, you know, as well as silks and satin, she probably would feel, not only is this impractical, but it isn't actually me. It's not me.
No, absolutely. And there would have been people judging you on what you wore. And remember, lots of people made public were out in public a lot more than possibly we are at the moment. You would have been out in your society, whatever that was, and you would have gone to church every week, and that would be the chance to show off your better clothes. But people would have been looking at what you were wearing. And especially if you were a young girl or younger person and you weren't married and didn't have a lot of money to spare, you would have been very looked down on for wearing anything that made you stand out, and say, look at me, look at me. You did it in subtle ways, but you wouldn't have had a lot of fancy, flashy jewelry or just fun jewelry like we have now. You would have had a few key pieces. I'm wearing quite a modest little shell necklace, pearls. So not what I would call your blingy jewelry. So diamonds, rubies, emeralds, all the flashy jewels would have been for going to a fancy ball or being presented at court. But day to day, you would have worn something quite modest, really. And I suppose it is, as a woman, when your appearance is possibly to help you move forward to marriage, you want to appear modest, virtuous, elegant, tasteful. You want to attract that sort of a partner, don't you? You don't want someone flashy who's going to maybe give you fancy jewelry one day and then basically lose it gambling the next.
And going back to where we started about the little black dress and the Christmas party, I'm pleased to say that Jane Austen did have one. Though in her case, from the evidence of her 1814 letters, it's her little brown gown.
Yes, absolutely.
There's a letter she writes to her sister, of course, in March, where she talks. It's hilarious. They obviously clearly talk about their clothes a lot. So she goes, a grand thought has struck me as to our gowns. For 6 minutes of mourning makes so great a difference. And then because of course mourning is signaled by what you wear. And she is thinking economically about how they can do this with veils and ribbons rather than having to shell out for a black gown. And then she goes on to talk about almost everyone was in mourning last night, but my brown gown did very well. It's almost as if this gown has a separate existence for herself. It's turned up at the party almost without her. And then she goes on about ribbons and trimmings are all the fashion in Bath. And I dare say the fashions of the two places are alike enough in that point to content me. So she's doing what you were saying earlier. She's doing that little bit of accent, the ribbons and trimmings on this standard brown gown, and making it work for her. She's rocking her style.
Yes, and if you see the movie, the most recent Emma movie, she has the most parade of beautiful, well-researched gowns, and she has about 20, I think, in the course of the movie. You would never have had, even as Emma would never have had that many gowns because they were very
okay. So right now, this is where we get to it, Kate. Let's talk about adaptations. So, which adaptation do you think has done the most accurate version of what Jane would have worn? Or
Oh,
her
that's tough.
characters would have worn,
That's tough.
of course.
The most recent Emma has the most well-researched gowns, I would say, but it's not necessarily what Jane would have worn. I would tend to go more for the 1995 Pride and Prejudice. I know for a fact they actually had fashion students, because they couldn't find enough block printed fabric. They actually had the fashion students in a little sweatshop somewhere block printing fabrics for them, things like that. And I think that the more simple gowns, they definitely had some gowns that crossed across the front and had a little bib that fastened in front for wearing. They looked more realistic to me, and for me, I think that was reasonably well researched. The men's clothing was quite good as well, and I was absolutely I wasn't outraged, but I was annoyed, shall we say, at Sanditon when that came out, because we were all hoping, we're in an age where the research is out there, the technology is out there to create really beautiful, well represented Regency attire. And as you know, the men particularly look fantastic in Regency wear. And my husband, when he's walking around Bath in his Regency outfit with his top hat on, he gets compliments, not necessarily because people know what he's wearing. They just notice that he looks really good in it, and it's fitted and it fits him. So it's not fancy dress. It's clearly clothing that is made for him. And that's what you would have got at the Regency time. So back to the adaptations, I was outraged at Sanditon because somebody who was described as a duke was wearing a hat that looked like it belonged to the Artful Dodger. It was sort of bashed around. It had obviously clearly been in the prop house for way too long. And it looked like any minute somebody was going to put their fist through the crown of it. It looked awful. And I was just crying on the inside, because I know how beautiful a well-made top hat can look, and how it can just look so dashing and elegant and sexy, basically. So I was thought, opportunity missed, Sanditon. Badly done, Sanditon. Badly done.
Badly done. Excellent. I think one of the films which I appreciated the attempt to vary was the one that was the biopic Becoming Jane, which obviously was a complete fiction in terms of what they did with it. But they did actually make a point of going for 1790s fashions.
Yes.
As opposed to the typical empire line, the under the bust line, which and of course it'd be quite nice to see a Pride and Prejudice set in that period, because it was written, the first version was written, so it'd be quite nice to have a little departure from the similar look gowns that we've had recently.
Yeah.
What about Bridgerton and their approach to Regency? I mean, can we even call them Regency costumes? I don't know. It's more like pantomime, really.
We can say that they have used the Regency style as a starting off point, shall we say? And I'm fine with Bridgerton in terms of it's a fantasy. If you've ever read the Julia Quinn books, they're a fantasy. They're a fun, frothy romance. And
they're much funnier than the series.
They are much.
They're very well worth a beach read.
I love Julia Quinn. So basically, in conveying that, I think they're wonderful. I can't hand on heart call them accurate representations of Regency costume, but I think, why should they? They're not really claiming to be that historical. They're imagining a fantasy Regency that might have been, and in that sense, I think in terms of creativity, color, joie de vivre, whatever you want to call it, they're great. And I'm definitely of the position that I love history, and I'm a great advocate of learning about history and knowing what really happened. But if there's a doorway that leads somebody to read Jane Austen, Bridgerton could be it. And they hopefully might want to know, oh, this looks an interesting period. If they've never come across it before, maybe I'll do some research and find out more about it. And in that sense, great. But I wouldn't necessarily, I couldn't hand on heart call them historically accurate costume. No.
The gentlemen seem to be slightly more toned down. I mean, they look very fine indeed. Let's say.
One thing that drove me bananas as a costume aficionado, nobody wears hats. or very, very, very few people wear hats. And that is such, if you know the Regency period and you know what a carnival it was for headgear, that's a crime.
Yeah. In
And
fact,
one of my
that's
friends who's,
pretty true. That's
yeah,
pretty true of a lot of historical, all
oh
not
yeah.
just the Regency period. It's because hats are regarded as being a problem for the actors, restricting.
Well, but
You know,
are they?
but
But are they, Julia? I think
exactly.
they frame
I
the
don't
head
agree.
beautifully.
Yeah.
Look at Gentleman Jack, okay? Look at they're
Yeah.
all wearing hats there. They all look fantastic, and they frame the face beautifully. They focus the vision, and you can have a heck of a lot of drama in your costume through a hat. Where we've got one of my friends who wears what she calls her bitch hat, because it's very Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and you don't mess with someone wearing a hat like that.
Yeah.
And one of my friends who's a milliner actually has done a series of hats called the Missing Hats of Bridgerton, and she's basically shown what you could have done with millinery, and they're fantastic. They've got butterflies on them. They've got all bits that clearly show somebody's status, and she's had a lot of fun with them. And indeed, in the 1995 Pride and Prejudice, when the Bingley sisters come into the room, they're wearing fabulous turbans of the time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
turbans, they don't hide your face, but they're a really good way of showing status. You've got your peacock feathers, you've got your bit of blingy jewelry, silks and satins wound around. It's fantastic. And I'm wearing a cap at the moment that denotes that I'm a married lady. I'm a lady of a certain age. As a young woman, you probably wouldn't have your head covered so much, and that's fine. But as an older woman, one of the fun things you could do was have a play with caps, and you'd have a very fine lacy one, possibly if you're high status, and probably a fairly serviceable linen one as a maidservant. But the one thing hats do give you and caps do give you is it's two major things. One, you are keeping your head covered. And where do we lose heat the most often? Through our heads. So nobody would have been wandering around out in the open air, especially not in wintertime, without a hat on. It just, you'd be daft. You'd be like throwing all your clothes off and saying, come on, Flew, take me. And the other thing, it's a respect. It's a sign of respect. Men doff their hats when they meet a lady. It's a sign of saying, I'm of a certain status, you're of a certain status. And I'm keeping my head covered. I'm not throwing it all to the winds and having my hair falling loose down my back in ringlets and running around along beaches and things. Sorry, Sanditon.
So we're coming to the end now of our little discussion about fashion, and let's go back to our original question: is what would Jane do about getting ready for that Christmas party? I've got an image of her probably reaching for her brown gown, getting dressed with Cassandra, having a giggle.
Definitely.
Making sure, doing each other's dresses up at the back if they haven't got a maidservant. And having great fun with just little touches. Not going overboard.
Because you didn't have Christmas trees, folks. You don't have Christmas trees in movies. That came in with Queen Victoria. But you would have had mistletoe. You would have brought in the greenery into your house. So I can definitely see her putting up and pricking her finger and saying a few choice words about holly and fir boughs and decorating with any little bits of brightness. And it's very important, isn't it, at this time of the year to have brightness, sparkle, a bit of cheer around for those long dark nights. And it's I've got a Jane Austen's Christmas book, and it says, in Jane's England, the Christmas holidays lasted for several weeks due to in part to the tedious journeys, which we still have today, undertaken to visit family for the holidays, and the quite obvious fact from several of her novels, as well as from her own letters, that guests were reluctant to leave again. So she would have been getting the house ready, definitely would have been thinking about, maybe adding a few little trimmings to her own little dress, and generally been preparing for a Christmas siege almost, I imagine. She had people visiting.
Well, that sounds quite familiar, actually. So, Kate, as we finish, what is the 33rd Foot going to be doing for Christmas? Do you gather or do you wait for the nicer weather?
Well, funny enough, we're having our annual Christmas meal together next weekend. So we're all gathering together in a tavern. Very coarse of us, I know, but we are ordinary soldiers after all. And I don't think we'll be killing a goose or anything like that, but we'll be sitting down together and socializing. And that for me is the spirit of Christmas, is getting together and having a good time. As well as thinking of others, obviously. But generally, just remembering what you're thankful for. And one thing reenacting definitely does is it makes me count my blessings. I've got fire, I've got four walls to live in, and I've got a ready supply of food, and I'm very grateful for that.
And I suppose I should ask if anyone's inspired to want to join a reenactment group. What's the best way for them to go about that?
Well, it's quite interesting psychologically for me when people say, "Oh, you do this funny hobby. How on earth do you get into that?" The first thing I say is, "What are your passions? What do you like now?" And you can bring that into reenacting. So if you like cooking, what sort of dishes do you like? If you like sewing, what clothing do you like sewing? Music, drama, obviously. And then I say, look around at what's in your local area, because obviously for reenacting, I travel all over the country. We end up in castles, great houses, beautiful, beautiful places that you would never normally possibly get to see without this hobby. And I've rowed Napoleon out to a yacht in the south of France, and I was on a yacht in the south of France for 5 minutes, but I was on it. That I would never normally have done. We've actually been handed the keys to a castle and say, right, lock yourself in for the night. And we've all sat there just telling ourselves ghost stories and scaring ourselves silly. So see what your passion is, and it's what music do you like. I read Jane Austen as quite a young age. I was precocious, of course, as about a 12-year-old, and I got into it through that. And I love Georgette Heyer, so that she is wonderful at creating a Regency world. So I already had that interest. And then I actually got into it through my partner and reader. I married him, who was doing American Civil War at the time. And I love photography. So he said, well, yes, you can stand at the sidelines and take photographs, but the best way to experience it, he's very sneaky, my partner, is to get dressed up and be part of it. And he was so right. So I've had some wonderful photographs over the years because I've joined in and been less obvious to the reenactors around me. I don't like taking stage photographs. I like taking candid snaps. But what is your passion? So Julie, what is your favourite historical period, do you think?
Oh, it's this one. So I even did a doctorate in this period. So
yeah.
1790 to 1830 is
absolutely.
my band.
And as I say, there's lots of, basically, your own reenactment group. You can create your reenactment group of one if you want to, but it's much more fun with other people. And there are 1790s groups out there. Now, I obviously, because of who I joined, I know a lot about the militaria groups out there. So there is a 1790s, there's the American War of Independence. There's groups out there doing that. And they will go across to America and they will join up with other groups as well. But you can do absolutely anything. I've seen Arctic explorers of the Edwardian era. I've seen Scythians, Romans, Greeks, you name it. There's a reenactment out there for you. And it's quite funny, if the passions that you already have will generally equate to a period. So if you like heavy metal music, maybe Vikings are for you. So think about what you already like doing and think about where that might best fit into a historical period.
So I suppose if people want to join, a session with Google helps, but also look out for people appearing locally and go up and talk to them.
Go up and talk to them. Yes, absolutely. And there's stuff happening all over. And what I really love doing as a reenactor is going to a historical site and inhabiting it and making it come alive. And that for me is the whole point of reenacting, is to make people appreciate history and realize how we're all interconnected, and history isn't so strange after all. It's not a disconnected thing. It's a long journey that you're part of.
Yeah. So my reenactment is what I do when I write. So writing historical novels, the Jane Austen series, The Diamond of Drury Lane, these books I've written are all about doing that, but in a way through text. That's how I do it.
Yes, you're living in that
world.
That's
another possibility for you.
Yes,
if you're thinking of how do you get into a period, try imagining yourself there and writing about it. So thank you very much. This is the end of 2021. Can you believe it?
No.
And we're going to reconvene in 2022 to find out what would Jane do about that. Who knows what's just around the corner. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you for having me.